Back to the Future. Could it actually happen with a real time machine?
On a January night in 1995, millions of Americans driving dark highways heard a stranger's voice come through their radios. The voice was shaking. The man said he was calling from a garage in rural Missouri, and that something on his workbench had just stopped existing. Not moved, not fallen. Stopped existing. And then, a heartbeat later, existed again. The host of the show had spent years listening to hoaxers, dreamers, and liars. He knew what performance sounded like. This didn't sound like performance. It sounded like a man asking for help. 2 years later, that man was gone. Investigators who reached his property found the garage reduced to ash. Melted copper had fused into the concrete. Industrial transformers sat cracked open by heat no household fire should produce, and burned into the center of the floor was a perfect circle, 6 feet across, as if something round and impossibly hot had briefly rested there. There was no body, there were no remains. There was only a toolbox, and inside it, a note in his handwriting. A single, cryptic sentence about how time was never really the point. His name was Mike Marcum. And to understand what happened in that garage, you have to go back to where his obsession began. Mike Marcum was never supposed to matter to physics. He held no degrees. No laboratory would have hired him. He grew up in small-town Missouri in the 1970s, the kind of kid who couldn't leave a machine intact. Radios gutted on the kitchen table. Television chassis hauled home from the dump. Motors rewound by hand until they screamed back to life. Neighbors saw a boy playing with dangerous junk. Mike saw a conversation. Electricity, to him, wasn't a utility. It was a voice, and he spent 20 years learning to speak it. By the early 90s, he was an adult living alone with a garage full of salvaged equipment. And one night, that long conversation finally answered back. The device at the center of the story couldn't have been more ordinary. A Jacob's ladder. 2 angled metal rods with a high-voltage arc crawling up between them. Science teachers build them. Halloween displays use them. But Mike made one modification no textbook suggested. He aimed a cheap laser pointer directly through the rising arc. For a while, nothing. Then the pitch of the electrical hum bent. The arc, normally chaotic, seemed to gather itself, tightening into something that looked deliberate. And on the bench beside it, a steel washer blinked. Gone, then back, occupying its exact position as though nothing had happened. Mike spent the following nights feeding the field, coins, screws, scraps of metal. When the voltage, the beam, and the arc aligned just right, small objects would briefly leave reality. No flash, no sound, no motion. Just a hole in the world where matter used to be, and then the quiet, uncanny correction as it returned. He noticed the garage itself changing during these moments. The air grew dense. Ozone stung his nose, but underneath it sat something colder and stranger that he could never name. His dog began refusing to enter the building. Mike didn't know what he'd built. He only knew he needed a witness, someone to hear it out loud before he decided he'd gone insane. That's what brought him to late-night radio in January 1995, to Coast AM and its host, Art Bell, the national confessional for the unexplainable. Bell challenged him gently. Heat distortion? An optical trick? Mike's reply is what made the call legendary. He said he could feel it when objects vanished. The garage would go heavy and still, like a held breath. Animals sensed it before he did. Bell gave him sober advice. Document everything, get witnesses, and stop treating a possible hole in physics like a weekend hobby. Mike took none of it. Instead, he escalated. That summer, he decided his machine was starving for power, so he stole 6 industrial transformers from a rural substation and wired them into his rig. The power draw was so violent, it browned out neighboring properties. Utility crews traced the drain straight to his garage door, and Mike Marcum went to county jail for 2 months. Prison didn't cure the obsession. It concentrated it. He filled his sentence with sketches and schematics, and when he called Art Bell again after his release, listeners noticed the change instantly. The nervous hobbyist was gone. This voice was fixed, narrowed, consumed. The objects, he said, weren't flickering anymore. They were staying gone, seconds at a time, and they were coming back wrong. A block of wood returned unnaturally cold. A fresh flower reappeared withered, as if it had aged days and moments. Then he described the mouse. 5 seconds inside the field. It came back alive and broken, circling, thrashing, refusing food, dead within 2 days. Art Bell, a man rarely at a loss, went quiet. Then he told Mike, plainly, to stop. Mike said he couldn't. He was too close. In early 1996, Mike made what would become his final call. The field, he claimed, had grown large enough for a human being. He had stepped part way in himself, and inside, the world outside slowed. Sound smeared. Movement stretched like taffy. When he stepped back out, the clocks had jumped ahead of him. Bell asked the only question that mattered. Had he built a time machine? Mike's answer was more unsettling than a yes. He said he honestly didn't know, that whatever the field was doing to objects, time travel might be the smallest part of it. He promised to call back in March with proof. Video, data, witnesses. March came. The call never did. His phone was dead, his mail bounced. And when people finally checked the property in 1997, they found the burned garage, the scorched circle, the ruined transformers, and the note in the toolbox. A missing person report was filed and led exactly nowhere. Officially, the case simply stopped. Unofficially, it was just beginning. In the years after, the Internet adopted Mike Marcum as one of its founding mysteries. And in the late 90s, researchers digging through newspaper archives surfaced the detail that turned a strange story into a chilling one. A clipping, reportedly from 1930. An unidentified man's body washed ashore on a California beach. Early 30s. Clothes that struck witnesses as oddly out of fashion, not old-fashioned, but wrong, ahead of their time. And in his pocket, a small rectangular metal device covered in buttons and markings nobody could interpret. To believers, the conclusion wrote itself. Mike had stepped fully into his machine in 1997 and fallen out of it 67 years before, into an ocean, decades before his own birth. Is the clipping real? No one has ever produced an original copy. Like everything in this case, it exists in the gap between evidence and legend. Impossible to confirm, impossible to fully dismiss. So, what can we actually stand on? A real man named Mike Marcum existed. His calls to Coast AM are real recordings you can listen to tonight. The Transformer theft and jail time are documented. And at some point in the late 90s, he dropped out of public view and never returned to the airwaves. Everything beyond that, the fire, the circle, the note, the body on the beach, lives in the territory where folklore grows. Unverifiable, unforgettable. But here's the detail worth sitting with. In his final calls, Mike had stopped talking about traveling through time. He talked about perception, about how the field didn't seem to move things through the world so much as change how the world held on to them. Maybe he was a brilliant amateur destroyed by his own equipment. Maybe he was a storyteller who built the perfect legend and walked away from it. Or maybe, in a garage in Missouri, a self-taught obsessive brushed against something physics hasn't named yet, and it kept him. Whatever the truth is, one thing hasn't changed in nearly 30 years. Nobody has ever proven Mike Marcum is dead, and nobody has ever proven he isn't out there still, somewhere or somewhen, waiting to make one last call.